Edogawa Rampo, the traveler with the pasted rag picture. If this story was not a dream or a temporary illusion of my insanity, the man traveling with the pasted rag picture must have been a madman. But just as dreams sometimes give us a glimpse into another world that is somehow different from this one, and just as madmen see and hear things that we cannot sense at all, perhaps I, through the mysterious lens of the atmosphere, caught a glimpse of a corner of another world that is outside the field of vision of this world for a moment. It was a warm, slightly cloudy day. At that time, I was on my way back from going to Ozu to see the mirage. When I tell this story, my close friends sometimes ask me if I have ever been to Ozu. When I think about it, I can't provide any clear evidence that I have ever been to Ozu. So perhaps it was just a dream after all. But I have never had a dream with such rich colors before. The scenery in my dreams is almost always completely colorless, just like a black and white movie. But the scene inside the train at that time, with its the pasted rag picture print as the centerpiece in purple and crimson colors, is burned into my memory vividly, like the pupils of a snake's eyes. I wonder if there is such thing as a dream in a colored movie. That was the first time I saw a mirage. I had imagined something beautiful like an old-fashioned painting, but when I saw a real mirage, I felt a shock close to fear that made me break out in a cold sweat. A swarm of people gathered in the pine-lined rows on the beach in Wozu, holding their breath and gazing at the vast sky and sea below them. I have never seen such a quiet sea. It was a great surprise for me, as I had always thought of the Sea of Japan as a rough sea. The sea was gray, without a single wave, and seemed a swamp stretching into the distance. And there was no horizon like in the Pacific Ocean. Instead, the sea and sky blended into the same gray, and it seemed as if the whole place was covered in a mist of unknown thickness. Through the upper mist that we had assumed was the sky, it was actually the surface of the sea, and a large, ghostly white sail glided by. The mirage was like dropping ink onto the surface of a milky film, and then letting the ink naturally spread, creating an incredibly gigantic film that was then projected into the sky. Through the distorted lenses of the misty atmosphere, the distant forests of the Noto Peninsula appeared in the sky right in front of us, vaguely and absurdly enlarged, like a black insect under an unfocused microscope looming over the viewer's head. It resembled a strangely shaped black cloud, but whereas a black cloud's location is clearly known, a mirage, strangely enough, has an extremely unclear distance from the viewer. It could look like a large monster drifting on the ocean in the distance, or like a strange mist looming before your very eyes, or even like a single speck of cloudiness floating on the surface of the viewer's cornea. This ambiguity of distance gives the mirage an eerie, maddening feeling that is even more unimaginable. Giant, pitch-black triangles of vague shape were piled up like towers, which collapsed in the blink of an eye, stretched out horizontally and ran like a long train, then collapsed into several pieces and looked like a row of cypress treetops. And while they appeared to be motionless, before you knew it, they transformed into completely different shapes. If the magic of mirages can make people go insane, then I probably couldn't escape it, at least until I was on the train on my way home. After standing there for 2 hours gazing at the strange phenomenon in the sky, I certainly felt something completely different from my normal life until we left Ozu that evening and spent the night on the train. Perhaps it was a kind of temporary madness that invades people's minds, like a random attacker. It was around 6 o'clock in the evening when I boarded the train from Ozu Station to Ueno. By some strange coincidence, or perhaps trains in that area are always like this, the second-class carriage I was in was as quiet as a church, and there was only one other person there besides me, crouched on a cushion in the far corner. The train ran endlessly along the steep cliffs and sandy beaches of the lonely coast, making a monotonous mechanical sound. Deep in the mist above the sea, I could vaguely sense the blood-black sunset. The strangely large white sails glided through them like a dream. It was a muggy day with no wind, and the breeze that crept in through the open train windows as we traveled was ghostly and short-lived. Many short tunnels and rows of snow protection pillars separated the vast gray sky and sea into stripes as we passed. As we passed the Oyashirazu cliffs, the brightness of the electric lights inside the train and the sky seemed the same, and dusk was approaching. Just then, the only passenger in the opposite corner suddenly stood up, spread a large wrapping cloth over a cushion, and began to wrap up a flat piece of luggage about 20 inches long and 30 inches wide that was leaning against the window. This gave me a strange feeling. The flat object was most likely a picture frame, but it was leaning with the front facing out of the window, as if for some special purpose. I could only imagine that it had once been wrapped in a wrapping cloth and then taken out and leaned against the window like that. Also, when I caught a glimpse of it as he was rewrapping it, the vividly colored picture on the front of the frame looked strangely vivid, somehow otherworldly. I took another look at the owner of this strange package, and I was surprised to find that the owner was even stranger than the strangeness of the package. He was wearing a very old-fashioned, narrow-collared black suit, the kind you might only see in faded photographs of our fathers when they were young. But it suited his tall, long-legged nature strangely well, and he even looked very stylish in it. His face was thin, and his eyes were a little glaring, but overall his appearance was neat and smart. His neatly parted hair was thick and shining black, so at first glance he appeared to be around 40 years old. But on closer inspection, his face was covered with numerous wrinkles, making him look more like 60. When I first noticed the contrast between his dark hair and the wrinkles that crisscrossed his pale face, I found it extremely eerie. After he carefully finished wrapping his belongings, he turned towards me, but at the same time I was intently watching what he was doing, so our eyes met. He then smiled faintly, the corners of his lips curling up as if he was embarrassed by something. I instinctively turned my head and returned the greeting. After that, we sat in each other's corners while we passed a few small stations, occasionally exchanging glances from afar, then awkwardly looking away. Outside the window it was dark. I pressed my face against the glass to peer out, but there was no light at all, apart from the occasional light of a fishing boat floating in the distance. In the endless darkness, our long and narrow carriage continued to rattle on, as if it were the only world in the world. It felt as if the whole world, every living thing, had vanished without a trace, leaving only the two of us behind in that dimly lit carriage. In the second-class carriage we were in, there was not a single passenger at any of the stations, and the conductor was never seen. Thinking about such things now, they seem extremely strange. I gradually began to feel afraid of this man, who looked to be in his 40s or 60s and had the appearance of a Western magician. Fear is something that, when there is nothing else to distract from, grows infinitely larger and spreads throughout your body. Finally, the fear filled me up to the tips of my hairs and I could no longer bear it, so I suddenly stood up and walked briskly towards the man in the far corner. It was precisely because I found him repulsive and frightening that I approached him. I gently sat down on the cushion opposite him and peered intently at his wrinkled white face, which looked even more bizarre up close, with a kind of mysterious, twisted feeling, as if I myself was a monster, squinting my eyes and holding my breath. The man had been greeting me with his eyes ever since I got up from my seat, but when I looked into his face, as if he had been waiting for me, he pointed with his chin to the flat luggage beside him and said without any preamble, as if it was a natural greeting, "Is this it?" His tone was so matter-of-fact that I couldn't help but be surprised. "You want to see this, don't you?" As I remained silent, he repeated the same thing. "Can I see it?" I was drawn in by his tone and ended up saying something strange. I definitely hadn't gotten up to look at the luggage. "I'll be happy to show you this. I've been thinking for a long time that you would come and see this." As the man, or perhaps it would be more appropriate to call him an old man, said this, he deftly unwrapped the large wrapping cloth with his long fingers and propped the picture-like object up against the window, facing me this time. I took a quick look at the surface and instinctively closed my eyes. I still don't know why, but somehow I felt I had to do so I closed my eyes for a few seconds. When I opened my eyes again, I was faced with something strange, the like of which I'd never seen before. But I don't have the words to clearly explain what was so strange about it. The frame was painted with a vicious array of muddy paints, mainly indigo, depicting a scene that looked like the backdrop of a palace in a kabuki play, with blue tatami mats and a lattice ceiling continuing into the distance, cut through several rooms and using perspective. A window was painted black in ink in the front left, and a desk of the same color was placed next to it, painted in a way that ignored angles. The background above could best be described as similar to the unique style of painting on votive plaques. Among the background, two figures, about 10 inches in size, stood out. The reason they stood out was because the two figures were the only ones made of pressed rag. A white-haired old man in old-fashioned black velvet clothing was sitting uncomfortably. Curiously, not only did his appearance, except for the color of his hair, resemble that of the old man, but even the tailoring of his clothing was identical. And a beautiful girl of about 17 or 18 years old, wearing a long-sleeved kimono with a black velvet sash, was leaning on the old man's lap with an indescribable sense of shame. It was a scene similar to a love scene in a play. Needless to say, the contrast between the old man and the young girl in Western clothing was extremely strange. But that was not what I meant by strange. In contrast to the crudeness of the background, the intricacy of the Oshi craftsmanship was astonishing. Every single wrinkle on the face was depicted, and the girl's hair was made of real hair, one by one, and tied up like human hair. And the old man's head was probably made of real white hair, which had been painstakingly planted in. The clothes had precise seams, and even millet-sized buttons in just the right places. The fullness of the girl's breasts, the lustrous curves of her thighs, the spilling scarlet crepe, the glimpse of skin color, and the shell-like nails on her fingers. If I had looked through a magnifying glass, I would have been able to see the pores and even the hairs. When it comes to the pasted rag picture, I have only ever seen intricately carved portraits of actors on Hagoida, and there are some Hagoida that are quite intricately carved, but this pasted rag picture was nothing like that. It was an extremely intricate work that could never be compared to anything like that. It was probably made by a master of the craft, but that wasn't what struck me as strange. The entire frame seemed very old, and the muddy paint in the background had come off in places, and the girl's fury sewed in the old man's black velvet had faded beyond recognition. But even though it was faded and worn, it still retained an indescribable venom, a gleaming vitality that burned into the back of the viewer's eyes, which was quite strange if you like that kind of thing. But that's not what I mean by strange. If I had to say, it was that both of the people in the pressed picture were alive. In a bunraku puppet show, once or twice during a day's performance, the puppet used by the master suddenly becomes alive, as if the gods had breathed life into it, but the figures in the picture seemed to live forever, as if they had been glued to the board in an instant, without giving the puppet a chance to escape. Perhaps because he saw the surprise on my face, the old man said in a delighted tone, almost shouting, "Oh, maybe you'll understand." While carefully unlocking the black leather case hanging from his shoulder, he took out a pair of very old-fashioned binoculars and handed them to me. "Take a look with this telescope." "No, it's too close from there." "Excuse me, but from a little further away." "Yes, there, that's fine." It was a really strange request, but my boundless curiosity got the better of me. So I did as the old man said, stood up, and took 5 or 6 steps away from the picture frame. The old man held the picture frame with both hands and held it up to the light so that I could see it better. Looking back, it must have been a really strange, crazy sight. The binoculars were probably imported from overseas some 20 to 30 years ago. They were the kind of oddly shaped prism binoculars that we used to see on the signboards of opticians when we were children. But the black leather covering had worn off due to overuse, revealing brass fabric in some places. It was a very old-fashioned and nostalgic item, just like the owner's clothes. Interested in the binoculars, I twisted them around for a while, and then when I brought them up to my eyes with both hands to look through them, suddenly the old man let out a shriek-like yell, and I nearly dropped the binoculars. "No, no, it's upside down. You shouldn't look through it upside down." The old man turned pale, his eyes wide open, and he was waving his hands repeatedly. I couldn't understand the old man's strange behavior and why looking through binoculars upside down was so bad. I see, it was upside down. I was so focused on looking through the binoculars that I didn't pay much attention to the old man's suspicious expression, and I turned the glasses the right way up and quickly put them up to my eyes to look at the person in the painting. As the focus came together, the two circular fields of vision gradually merged into one, and a vague rainbow-like image gradually came into view, and the astonishingly large image of the girl from the chest up filled my field of vision as if it were the whole world. I have never seen anything like that before or since, so it is difficult to convey to the reader. But if I try to recall a similar feeling, perhaps I should describe it as resembling the appearance of a female diver at a certain moment as she dives into the sea from a boat. When the diver's body is at the bottom of the ocean, the complex pulsation of the blue water layer makes her body twist and turn unnaturally like seaweed, and her outline becomes blurred, making her look like a whitish ghost. But as she floats up, the blue of the water layer gradually fades, and her shape becomes clearer. When her head pops out above the water, the white monster in the water suddenly reveals its true human form as if it had woken up. Just like that, the rag girl appeared before me in the binoculars and began to wriggle as a life-size living girl. On the other side of the lens of the old-fashioned 19th century prism binoculars lies another world beyond our imagination, where a girl in a fury-sewed kimono and a white-haired man in old-fashioned Western clothing live mysterious lives. The wizard is now making me peek into something I should not be looking into. With a strange feeling that I can't describe, I was captivated by this mysterious world. The girl wasn't moving, but her entire aura was completely different from when I saw her with the naked eye. She was full of life. Her pale face flushed a slightly pink color. Her chest was pulsating. I could actually hear her heartbeat, and it seemed as if the vitality of the young woman was evaporating from her body through her clothing. After taking a general look at the woman's entire body with my binoculars, I turned them towards the happy-looking, white-haired man against whom the girl was leaning. The old man was also living in the world of the binoculars, but he had his arm around the shoulder of the young woman, who looked about 40 years younger than him, and looked very happy. But strangely, his wrinkled face, which filled the entire lens, revealed an expression of anguish beneath the hundreds of wrinkles. This may have been because the lens made the old man's face look strangely large, as if it were 10 inches in front of my eyes. But the longer I looked at the old man's face, the more frightening it became. His expression was a mixture of sorrow and fear. Looking at it, I felt like I was having a nightmare, and looking through the binoculars felt unbearable. So I instinctively took my eyes off the binoculars and looked around. I found myself on a lonely night train, and the picture frame and the old man who had held it were still the same. It was pitch black outside the window, and the monotonous sound of the wheels could still be heard. I felt like I had woken up from a nightmare. "You have a strange look on your face." The old man leaned the frame back against the window and sat down, then looked at me, beckoning me to sit on the other side, and said this and that. "I feel a little dizzy." "It's so steamy," I greeted him, trying to hide my embarrassment. Then the old man hunched his back, brought his face closer to mine, and moving his long, slender fingers on his lap as if to signal, whispered in a low voice, "They were alive, weren't they?" Then, as if he was disclosing something of great importance, he hunched his back even more, stared at me with his glaring eyes wide open, and whispered to me, "Wouldn't you like to hear their true life stories?" I thought that perhaps I had misheard the old man's low, murmuring voice because of the swaying of the train and the rumbling of the wheels. "Did you say their life stories?" "Yes, life stories," the old man replied in the same low voice, "especially the life story of the white-haired old man." "Since he was young?" I asked the old man. That night I also spoke in a strangely off-key manner. "Yes, it's a story from when he was 25 years old," the old man answered. "I'd like to hear it." I said to the old man as if it were nothing, as if I was urging him to tell me the story of a normal living person. The old man then twisted the wrinkles in his face with delight and said, "Ah, you really are willing to listen," and began the following strange story. It was a major event in my life, so I remember it well, but it was on the evening of April 27th, 1895, that my brother became like that, he said, pointing to the old man on the picture frame. At the time, both my brother and I were still living at home, but our house was in Nihonbashi Dori 3 and my father ran a kimono shop. It was shortly after the 12-story building was built in Asakusa, So my brother enjoyed going up to that 12-story building, Ryunkaku, every day. That's because my brother had a strange love for exotic things and new things. He found this telescope in front of a tool shop in Yokohama's Chinatown, which had belonged to the captain of a foreign ship. He said he paid a lot of money for it at the time. Every time the old man said "my brother," he would look at the old man in the picture or point at him as if he was actually sitting there. The old man mixed up his real brother from his memory with the white-haired old man in the picture and spoke as if the old man in the picture was alive and listening to him, as if he was a third party right next to him. But strangely enough, I didn't feel that it was wrong at all. At that moment, we may have been in another world that transcended the laws of nature, that was somehow at odds with our world. Have you ever been to the 12th floor? Ah, no, that's a pity. I wonder what wizard built it. It was a truly extraordinary and strange thing. On the surface, it was said to have been designed by an Italian engineer named Barton. Just think about it. At that time, the only famous attractions in Asakusa Park were the Man of Spider show, the sword dancing girls, the ball riding show, the Gensui top spinning show, and the peeping prank show. The octagonal top of the 250-foot tall building was as pointy as a Chinese hat, and if you climbed to a high elevation, you could see the red monster from anywhere in Tokyo. As I said, in the spring of 1895, shortly after my brother got these telescopes, something strange happened to him. My father was extremely worried that my brother had become mad, but as you can imagine, I was very close to my brother, and his strange behavior made me extremely worried. To explain, my brother, he barely ate, he didn't speak to his family, and when he was at home, he would shut himself in his room and think about nothing. His body had become thin, his face was ashen as if he had tuberculosis, and his eyes were wide open. My brother never had a good complexion to begin with, but he looked even paler and more depressed. So I felt really sorry for him. And yet every day, without fail, he would wander off somewhere from noon until dusk, as if he was going to work. When I asked my brother where he was going, he wouldn't say a word. My mother worried. I tried various ways to ask my brother why he was depressed, but he wouldn't open up at all. This went on for about a month. I was so worried that one day I secretly followed him to see where he was going. That was what my mother asked me to do. That day was a gloomy, cloudy day, just like today. But after noon, my brother put on a black velvet suit that he had had tailored around that time, which was very fashionable for the time. And with this binoculars slung over his shoulder, he walked down Nihonbashi Street towards the horse-drawn railway. I followed him, trying not to be noticed. Then my brother met up with a horse-drawn railway bound for Ueno and hopped on board. Unlike trains today, I couldn't get on the next car and follow him. After all, there weren't many horse-drawn railways then. I had no choice but to use the pocket money my mother gave me and get on a rickshaw. Even with a rickshaw, it was not difficult for a slightly more vigorous rickshaw puller to follow the horse-drawn train so as not to lose sight of it. When my brother got off the horse-drawn train, I got off the rickshaw and followed him again. And so we ended up at, of all places, the Cannon Hall in Asakusa. My brother walked straight past the main hall and pushed his way through the crowds of people between the sideshow tents behind the hall until he reached the 12-story tower I mentioned earlier. He entered through the stone gate, paid the fee, and disappeared into the tower through the entrance with a plaque that read, Ryunkaku. I was astonished, as I never imagined that my brother would be going to a place like this every day. As a child, I was not yet 20 years old at the time, so I had strange thoughts like maybe my brother was bewitched by the monster on the 12 stories. I had only been to the 12th floor once before, accompanied by my father, and had never been back since, so I felt a little uneasy. But since my brother was going up, I had no choice but to follow him up the dim stone staircase, about a floor behind him. The windows weren't very big, and the brick walls were thick, so it was cold, like a cave. It was during the Sino-Japanese War, so there were oil paintings of war hanging all over the walls, which were rare at the time. Between them, the gloomy stone staircase continued endlessly up, like a snail's shell. It was a really strange feeling. At the top, there was just an octagonal balustrade and no walls, so it was a corridor with a view of the outside. When we reached it, the place suddenly became bright, and I was surprised, especially since the dim journey up was so long. From there, the clouds were so low you could almost reach out and touch them. The roofs of Tokyo looked like jumbled garbage, and the Odaiba in Shinagawa looked like a bonsai stone. I tried to resist the urge to get dizzy and look down, and even the cannon hall was at a much lower level. The theater looked like a toy, and the people walking around looked like miniatures. A group of about 10 spectators were gathered at the top, gazing out towards the sea at Shinagawa while whispering to themselves, but my brother was standing alone at a distance, holding a telescope up to his eye and intently gazing at the Asakusa temple grounds. Looking at my brother from behind, I saw his velvet clothing standing out clearly against the dull, whitish clouds, with the scenery below vaguely visible. Even though I knew it was my brother, he looked divine, like a character in a Western oil painting, and I couldn't say a word to him. But then I remembered what my mother had told me, and I couldn't help it, so I approached my brother's back and called out, "Brother, what are you looking at?" My brother flinched and turned around, but made an awkward face and said nothing. I said, "Your father and mother are very worried about you. They've been wondering where you go every day, and now you've come to a place like this. Please tell me the reason. Please confide in me, your close brother, at least." I said luckily there was no one nearby, so I asked my brother from up there in the tower. He didn't open up for a while, but I kept asking him, and he finally gave in and told me the secret that had been troubling him for the past month. However, the cause of my brother's distress was a very strange thing. According to my brother, about a month ago, when he went up to the 12th floor and was looking out at the grounds of the cannon hall through the telescope, he caught a glimpse of a girl's face in the crowd. The girl was so beautiful that it was indescribable, as if she were from another world, and my brother, who was usually cold towards women, was completely captivated by the girl in the spyglass. My brother was so surprised at just one glimpse that he took his spyglass off, and then he tried to look again, searching feverishly in the same place. But the field of vision through the spyglass just couldn't reach the girl's face. Even if the girl looked close through the spyglass, she was actually far away, and in the middle of a large crowd of people. So just because you saw her once doesn't mean you could find her a second time. My brother couldn't forget the beautiful girl in the spyglass, and being a very shy person, he began to suffer from old-fashioned love sickness. Young people today might find this funny, but people back then were very naive, and many men fell in love with women at first sight and suffered from love sickness. Needless to say, my brother, unable to even eat properly, would drag his weakened body up the 12 stories to look through the telescope every day, as if it were his job, in the sad hope that the girl might pass by the grounds of the cannon hall again. Love is a strange thing. After my brother confessed his feelings to me, he began looking through the telescope again as if he had a fever. But I felt complete sympathy for his feelings, and although it was a futile search with no hope in 1,000, I didn't feel like telling him to stop, and with tears in my eyes, I just stared at my brother's back. And then, I will never be able to forget that mysteriously beautiful sight. It was more than 30 years ago, but when I cover my eyes like this, the dreamlike colors come to mind very vividly. When I was standing behind my brother, all I could see was the sky, and his slender Western-style figure rose up among the hazy clouds like a painting, and I almost mistook the clouds for his body floating in the air as they moved. But then, all of a sudden, like fireworks, countless red, blue, and purple balls rose up in the whitish sky, competing with each other. You probably won't understand if I explain it to you, but it really was like a painting, and also like an omen of some kind, and it gave me an indescribable, suspicious feeling. I quickly looked down to see what the reason could be, and realized that the balloon maker had made a mistake and sent all the rubber balloons flying into the sky at once. But back then, rubber balloons themselves were much rarer than they are now. So even though I knew what it was, I still felt strange. Strangely enough, and not that that was the trigger, but at that moment, my brother seemed very excited. His pale face flushed red, and he came towards me out of breath, and suddenly took my hand and said, "Come on, let's go. If we don't hurry, we won't make it." He pulled me along, and as I was being pulled down the stone steps of the tower, I asked my brother why, and he said that he had found the girl from some time ago and was sitting in a large room with blue tatami mats. So it would be fine to go there now, and that she would definitely be there. The place that my brother had guessed was behind the cannon hall, and a large room was supposed to be there. But when we went there and looked for it, although there was a pine tree, there was no house that looked like a house nearby, and we felt as if we were in a dream. I thought my brother had lost his mind, but I felt so sorry for him, looking so dejected, that I went around to the tea houses in the area to cheer him up. But the girl was nowhere to be found. While I was looking for the girl, I ended up parting ways with my brother. But after going around the tea houses and returning to the original spot under the pine tree, I found a peep show prankster doing business alongside the various stalls, making the sound of his whip. I looked over and saw my brother, crouching down and peering intently into the peep show prankster's glasses. I tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Brother, what are you doing?" He turned around in shock, and I still can't forget the look on his face at that moment. What can I say? My brother's face was sagging as if he was dreaming. His eyes were looking off into the distance, and even his voice sounded strangely hollow when he spoke to me. And then he said, "Hey, the woman we're looking for is among us." So I quickly paid the money and looked through the peep glasses, and it was a peep trick by Oshichi the greengrocer. There was a picture of Oshichi leaning on Kichiza in a study in Kichijoji. I'll never forget it. The peep trick couple were singing the lyrics, "Kneel down and let us know with your eyes," in unison, hoarsely, and using a whip to keep time. Ah, I can still hear that strange melody. "Kneel down and let us know with your eyes." The figures in the peep picture were made of pasted rag, but they must have been the work of a master of that craft. Oshichi's face was lively and beautiful. Even to my eyes, she looked truly alive. So it's no wonder my brother said what he said. My brother said that even if he found out that this woman was a fake, he would not give up. If only once I would like to become the man in the picture like Kichiza and talk to this woman, he said, standing there blankly, refusing to move. When I thought about it, the top of the peeping prank picture was open to let in light, so it must have been visible from the top of the 12-story building at an angle. By this time, the sun was setting and the people around were thinning out. Only 2 or 3 boys with short hair were wandering around in front of the peep show shop, reluctant to leave. It had been overcast since the afternoon, but by dusk the clouds had lowered to the point that it looked like it was about to rain at any moment, and the weather was so unpleasant that I felt even more oppressed and thought I might go mad. Then in the depths of my ears I could hear a sound like drums beating. My brother stood there, staring fixedly into the distance for what seemed like an hour. When it was completely dark and the gas lamps were beginning to flicker beautifully, my brother seemed to wake up with a start, grabbed me by the arm and said something strange. "I've got a great idea. Could you please turn this spyglass upside down, hold the big lens to your eye and look at me through it?" When I asked him why, he said, "Well, it's fine. Just do it," and refused to back down. However, I've never really liked glasses since I was born. Whether it's a telescope or a microscope, the effects are eerie, with faraway objects appearing to fly out before your eyes or tiny insects growing to be as large as animals. And because I hadn't often used my brother's treasured telescope, it seemed all the more like a magical machine to me. Moreover, it was after dark, when people's faces were hard to see, and standing behind the dreary cannon hall, so turning the telescope upside down to peer at my brother seemed crazy and a little creepy. But my brother asked me to, so I had no choice but to do as I was told and peer through it. Because I was looking upside down, my brother's figure, standing 15 feet away, had shrunk to about 20 inches, and because he was so small, he stood out clearly in the darkness. Nothing else was reflected, and only my brother's tiny figure in his clothes stood in the center of the glasses. I think he probably walked away. My brother then shrunk even further until he was about 10 inches tall and looked like a cute doll. Then his figure seemed to float in the air, and in the blink of an eye he melted into the darkness. I became scared. You may think I'm old enough to say this, but at the time, I was really scared. So I took the binoculars away, called out "brother," and ran in the direction where my brother had disappeared. But for some reason, no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't find my brother. He couldn't have gone far in time, and yet no matter where I look, I can't find my brother. Just like that, my brother has vanished from this world forever. Since then, I have become even more afraid of these evil machines known as spyglasses. I particularly hate this spyglass, which belonged to a foreigner, a captain of no particular country. I don't know about any other glasses, but I firmly believe that these glasses are the only ones that should never be looked at upside down, because doing so will bring about disaster. When you held it upside down earlier, you probably understand why I hurriedly told you not to look at it. However, after a long search, I grew tired and returned to the original spyglass shop. I suddenly noticed something. The reason was, I thought, that my brother had been so in love with the paper doll girl that he had used the power of the magic telescope to shrink his body to the same size as the ragdoll girl and sneak into her world. So I asked the peep show maker, who hadn't yet packed up his shop, to show me a picture of Kichijoji, and sure enough, there, in the spotlight, was my brother, turned into a ragdoll, and in the place of Kichiza, he was embracing Oshichi with a happy look on his face. But I didn't feel sad. I was so happy that my brother had achieved his wish that I was brought to tears. I made a firm promise with the peeping man that he would give the painting to me no matter how much it cost. Oddly enough, the peeping man didn't seem to notice that my older brother, dressed in Western clothes, was sitting there instead of Kichisa, and I hurried home to tell my mother the whole story. But my parents said, "What are you talking about? You must have had your mind wandering," and no matter what I said, they wouldn't believe me. "But that's only natural, isn't it? Right?" the old man said, and burst out laughing, as if to say that he found it hilarious. And strangely enough, I also sympathized with the old man and laughed out loud with him. They were under the impression that humans couldn't become things like the pasted rag picture. But the proof that he had become the pasted rag picture was that after that, my brother disappeared from this world. My parents made the completely wrong guess that my brother had run away from home. In the end, I didn't care what my mother said, so I begged my mother for money and finally got the pasted rag picture. I took it and traveled from Hakone to Kamakura. The reason was that I wanted my brother to have a honeymoon. As we were on the train, I thought back on that time. Just like today, I propped up this painting in the window and let my brother and his wife see the view outside. How happy my brother must have been. As for the girl, how could she be offended by such pure feelings from my brother? The two of them, blushing with embarrassment, touched each other's skin like a real newlywed couple, exchanging intimate, endless words of love. After that, my father quit his business in Tokyo and moved to his hometown in Toyama Prefecture. So I have always lived in Toyama Prefecture too, but it has been more than 30 years since then. So I wanted to show my brother the changed Tokyo for the first time in a long time. And that's why I'm traveling with him. But sadly, my dear friend, no matter how much the girl lives, she was originally a human creation and will not age. But my brother, even though he has become the pasted rag doll, has only had his form forcibly changed. He is still a human being with a lifespan, so he will age just like the rest of us. Just look. My brother, who was a beautiful youth of 25, has now turned gray-haired and has ugly wrinkles on his face. My, how sad my brother must be. The woman he is with remains young and beautiful, while he is the only one growing old and dirty. How horrible. My brother has a sad look on his face. For the past few years, he has always looked so distressed. When I think about that, I can't help but feel sorry for my brother. The old man looked sadly at the old man in the picture, and then, as if he had suddenly realized something, he said, "Oh, what a long story. But you understand, don't you? You won't call me crazy like the others do. Oh, that makes it worth my while to talk to you. Now, my brother and the girl must be exhausted. Besides, they must be embarrassed to have had such a conversation with you in front of them. Well, I'll let you rest now." As he said this, he gently wrapped the picture frame in a black cloth. At that moment, or was it just my imagination, the faces of the rag dolls seemed to crumble a little, and they looked a little embarrassed, with the corners of their lips giving me a greeting smile. The old man was quiet after that. I was also quiet. The train continued to make a dull thud as it ran through the darkness. After about 10 minutes of this, the sound of the wheels slowed down. 2 or 3 lights appeared outside the window, and the train came to a halt at a small station in the mountains. I saw a lone station attendant standing on the platform. "Well, I'll be going now. I'm going to stay at a relative's house nearby for the night," said the old man, standing up and clutching the wrapped frame. And with that greeting, he walked off the train. As I looked out the window, the back of the long, slender old man looked exactly like the old man in the pasted rag picture. He handed his ticket to the station attendant at the simple barrier and then disappeared as if blending into the darkness behind him.
This story ends here. Now, I must apologize to you all for two things. First, it's been 6 months since my last video. I was busy with other work during the summer, but even so, it was too long. I'm sorry, everyone. There's also one more thing I must apologize for. We have set subtitles on the videos on this channel so that people outside of English-speaking countries can enjoy them too. However, the subtitles were only reflected for 19 minutes, and the text after that could not be uploaded. As a result, when people from overseas watched The Human Chair and Monogram, they did not know the ending. I think it is very stressful not to know the ending of a mystery novel. I sincerely apologize for this. The Traveler with the Pasted Rag Picture, is also more than 19 minutes long, but I have found a way to upload the subtitles after the 19 minutes. So I've added subtitles to all of the videos, along with the previous ones. This channel plans to update videos once a month at the end of the month, except during the summer. Well, I'll see you again in a month.